The starting point is helping realize that hiring is a business goal. It's a business outcome. Just like revenue or customer growth or customer experience, recruiting has to be one of those top line goals and measure. And when you get it put into that echelon, you get the treatment and visualization in the same way.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I'm your host, Shannon Ogborn, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, an all-in-one recruiting solution for modern talent teams. I am here with our guest, Adam Ward, founding partner of Growth by Design. GBD helps high-growth companies develop recruiting fundamentals and support intentional business growth in alignment with their unique values and missions. Previous to co-founding GBD, Adam held a recruiting leadership role at Qualcomm, was one of the first recruiting leaders at Facebook where he saw them through IPO, and led the recruiting function at Pinterest, scaling from 200 to 2,000 and through IPO. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks to Ashby and thanks to you, Shannon, for having me.
Of course. So we'll just jump right in. You and I have had the opportunity to chat a lot about our topic today of stakeholder engagement. You all have even recently put out a newsletter that had some about this topic. Tell me a little bit why this topic is so important to recruiting leadership and recruiting teams.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. It's a very interesting time for companies and recruiting leaders. If you look back over the last 5 to 8 years, companies have really invested heavily in talent functions, and the competition for talent during that time was unprecedented. But we're now in an interesting time where some companies are taking stock and absorbing all that hiring they've made, adjusting to markets. And so what we're seeing is that companies are looking for a different level of partnership with their recruiting and talent leaders. And so it's something that we've been brewing for some time here. And I think it's coming to a bit of a head as the markets have shifted and companies are looking to adjust in the current environment. And so it's always been important that recruiting has had that seat at the table with the executives and leaders. But we've often found historically that actually recruiting leaders and recruiting teams weren't prepared to show up at the same level of depth, accuracy, data, and insights that maybe sales or finance or engineering leaders have. And so this gap has been growing over time and has come to this point.
Definitely. And I've noticed over my career as well that other folks in other parts of the organization, so like you said, sales, marketing, finance, engineering, they seem to have maybe a little bit better mentorship throughout their career on really getting that business knowledge to get their seat at the table and be prepared for it. So really excited to be talking about this today. One of the things that we had talked about is really being a trusted advisor versus a service provider and how that really leads to, stakeholder engagement and that seat at the table. Can you help us understand what is the difference between a trusted advisor and a service provider?
Yeah. And, when you are a service provider, you maybe don't have that seat at the table, the expectations are lower. But as we've seen this transition, trusted advisor is different. So let's start by defining those. A service provider might be seen as a recruiting team might be seen more as a staffing organization, a rec fulfillment operation, pushing paper, and where a lot of the influence and decision-making happens with the hiring manager alone. And the recruiting team is really just shepherding a process or moving candidates through a process. That might be a service provider. Some, things that you might think about if you have a rec request form that a hiring manager is filling out, here's what I want in a candidate. That is a service provider. If you're doing an intake side by side with a hiring manager and helping them think through what does success look like in 90 days for this candidate? what business objectives or outcomes will change because you're making this hire, and you're helping influence maybe the level or the scope or the background of that person that meets a business goal. That's a trusted advisor. So understanding like the differences between like filling out a request form versus doing a side-by-side intake. There's a very specific example of what that might look like. If recruiting gets handed a headcount number at the beginning of the year, you might be a service provider. If recruiting is in the room talking about, here's our capacity, here's what the market looks like, here's some of the challenges, here's what we feel like we can deliver, and helping get to an aligned goal of hiring cadence, you might be more of a trusted advisor. And so there's it's a change in kind of framing and conversation between the two, but there's a lot of work that it takes to get from, that, and a lot of inputs to get from service to trusted.
Absolutely. And as I've worked with a lot of our Ashby customers, we have a feature called the recruiting planner. And you can kind of back up into, if we need to make this many hires with our current pass-through rate, here's how many people would need to be in each stage over this period of time. And when we divide it sometimes by recruiters, they're like, oh my gosh, like there's no way that our recruiters could ever possibly fulfill this number of jobs, because they would have to, in theory, be doing like 80 phone screens a week, which just is not possible. So having access to that data to be in the room and to be able to provide that is also super helpful. I'm curious, have you ever worked at an organization where you stepped into a role and you felt like, okay, where our organization is at, we're a service provider, I want to move to a trusted advisor? Has that ever happened? And if so, what were kind of the tactical ways that you brought the organization to be seen as trusted advisors?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, both have had that lived experience, and now we work with a lot of GBD clients who are going through that transformation right now. And we've really boiled it down to 4 key things that we think that it takes to be able to make that transition. These are maybe like 4 attributes or behaviors that make a talent leader a trusted advisor. And you just talked about one, which is influences with data. And it's not just enough to lead with data. And I think that was maybe a concept 5 or 8 years ago, as recruiting data was more in its nascent days.
Yep.
But with platforms like Ashby, you can really actually start to influence with data. And the difference between that is that it's not just, not just having the information, but the ability to synthesize, organize, and visualize the data into a compelling narrative, right? And so you might be thinking about getting into that conversation with your sales team around hiring for the next year. And if you've hired for sales before, you probably know a lot of headcount gets front loaded into the beginning of the year. In a service provider model, you might just get handed that number. And then you have to take that number to your team and be like, hey team, guess what? We just got handed this number. Like that puts you in a bit of like a receivership and like a victim almost approach of things. And then your team freaks out and scrambles. Or maybe in between there, you get the number and you go back to the sales leaders like, we're not staffed to do that. We need to go ramp up recruiting. And so that actually delays the hiring of sales. And like, actually, maybe the company misses their number because recruiting wasn't in the room around some of those conversational input.
Right.
So bringing the data to say, hey, here's what our recruiting capacity is, but actually be able to show that in a visual of, hey, if we want this many SDRs in the building at the end of Q1, here's the work it's going to take, and here's the gap in capacity we have today, and then actually bringing actual solutions. And here's 3 things we could do to close that gap. That's a trusted advisor conversation where you're like, hey, we are committed to helping you get the right sales leaders and helping you drive the business, but here's where we need help. Here's the things we're going to need to do in advance of that. So the one would be influencing with data. The second would be thinking about market insights. So a leader who, a trusted advisor has a formal and informal network of peers in the relationships that they can tap into to bring real-time insights and benchmarking data to the executive or to the leader. So back to that sales leader example, the sales leader's like, well, why can't your team do 20 hires per recruiter per month? You're like, hey, here's some benchmark data of our peers, and here's what they're generally hiring on their sales organization per month, and help kind of frame it in some reality of that. But you can't really bring those market insights unless you have those relationships. So a trusted advisor is continually building relationships and networks with peers in other companies and other organizations like GBD and others so they can get those real-time insights and benchmarking data.
Yeah. I think helping leadership be realistic is one of the most important parts of being a trusted advisor, because without that realism approach, you may just be setting as a leader, your team up for failure.
And it's not saying no, right? You're not saying no, we
Right.
can't do that. We're saying here's the things that are going to take for us to get there, and how can we work together to make sure we do. A quick story around that was back at Pinterest, when Pinterest first started to monetize, we got the headcount number for sales in February for first half. And guess what? All of the headcount for sales was in the first half. So what we did was put together a sprint team of both equal parts recruiting and sales leaders. And we had a biweekly meeting and stand up to talk through what we're doing collectively to get towards the goal. Here's the amount, and we were able to map out to them and visualize, here's the number of interviews per week and how many hours of interviewing time we're going to need for your team. And specifically, on average, we're going to need 5 hours of interviews from this team of interviewers, right? And we're going to need SLAs around feedback, because if we're going to make hiring decisions and hiring committee decisions 3 times a week, we need interview feedback. So here's like what we need from you. Here's what we're going to bring to you. And then we would meet bi-weekly and be like, hey, we haven't got feedback. And they would help us chase down and create this like accountability between the two teams.
Right.
And it felt like a shared effort. And while it was a crazy sprint and really challenging, when you feel like you're in it with the business, you just make so much more progress. When it feels like you're on the same side of the table versus across the table, now you feel like you're more in this trusted advisor and partnership, and you make just such much faster and greater success and momentum.
Yeah. Yeah. A really good example of how recruiting is a part of, not apart from everybody's job. The whole business needs to be involved in recruiting for it to be successful. Okay. So we have influences with data, market insights. What else? What other attributes do you see that are really important for this?
Yeah, but you're kind of going into more around shared accountability. So we're big fans of the phrase of what gets measured gets done. And if you've ever been in a organization or recruiting team where recruiting alone holds the goal for hiring, then you might be more of a service provider versus trusted advisor. Shared accountability means, let's go back to that sales example. Myself and the RO chief revenue officer, we had the same goal around making these X number of hires in the first half of the year. There's no scenario where we miss or make the goal and recruiting alone gets the rewards or the punishment or impact of that. We're in it together. We're mutually aligned because the outcome is the same for us. So if recruiting alone is holding the goals, then these goals can cascade down into managers and individual contributors, things like that. But if there aren't those shared goals and shared accountability, then it's going to be really hard to make progress. And it's a funny thing, because as recruiting teams get more capable or larger, the responsibility shifts from the business of hiring into the functional team. When you're really early stage, if you're an early stage company and you have that feeling of like, we have one goal, we're all in it together, hiring is everyone's priority. Somehow, we see this inverse, correlation over time. The larger the company, the less engagement you get from hiring managers. And so it all of a sudden becomes not Adam in recruiting, it becomes the recruiting team. And there's this like disassociation. But no one should care more about hiring for their organization or the quality of talent than the receivership of that talent, right?
Yes.
And so when you say that out loud, you're like, then why is recruiting alone holding the goal? But that's what generally happens. So you need to create these tethering or anchors around shared accountability.
Yeah. How much of that shared accountability and the culture around that comes from the top down, like in your experience, especially working with your GBD clients? Where have been the struggles and the challenges in getting that shared accountability if from the top they're not buying in?
Yeah. It does start with the top, like any other like really challenging top goal. But the starting point is helping realize that hiring is a business goal. It's a business outcome. Just like revenue or customer growth or customer experience or user percentage, whatever it might be, recruiting has to be one of those top line goals and measure. And when you get it put into that echelon, you get the treatment and visualization in the same way. But it's also important to be measuring those goals in the same way and in the same cadence and the same format that you would any other business goal. So if you think about sales being really important to a company, they probably have a really clear cascading of goals into the organization. They are probably at the very least doing a QBR types of progress towards it. They're measuring the right things. They're signaling when we're behind track. Recruiting is no different. And so you want to be thinking about recruiting being reported and progress being reported at the same cadence and in the same way, and hopefully in the same conversation in the same room as any other key business goal. But where things fall apart, that's actually surprisingly, that's the easier part of the two.
Right.
Because when things really fall apart in companies and organization is at the line manager level, because often individual decisions are being made at the hiring manager level. And so if there isn't a clear set of manager effectiveness expectations in your company, that's a great starting point. What does it mean to be an effective manager? Hopefully, a key part of that, in addition to other things around feedback, setting goals, performance, is also the ability to hire for your team. So if you're going to be measured as a manager, as an effective manager around hiring, now you've built in some of these incentives that they're going to be measured on this too. But it can't be just enough around like being effective hiring. Let's get really clear what that means, right? That means that you are thinking about scoping a role appropriately. You're making hiring decisions in a timely manner. There might be diversity measures behind that. There might be time to fill. Again, goals that recruiting might own are mutually owned by hiring managers as well. And so you create this culture of talent and culture of recruiting through the organization. And let's not forget to celebrate it. And I think that's one problem with like a lot of these goals is like we don't actually recognize or celebrate people who are doing it well. It's not enough to like penalize them in performance reviews or all those things, but like let's actually celebrate and like help the company show what great looks like when it comes to effective hiring managers and leaders.
For sure. And it's surprising how many organizations don't set their managers up for success. There's no interview training, there's no hiring training, there's no real resources for these managers to be successful. So I feel like that's a big part of it too, is the organization needs to set the hiring managers up for success, which is often unfortunately missed, but I think getting better.
It's a great point. And we see a lot of our, business and training is around interview and hiring manager training. We see a lot of companies putting that in really early on, as early as 20 or 25 employees. And companies that haven't done that are kind of going back and resetting the table with that, particularly under, a time when maybe we're in lower hiring periods right now. We see more companies investing in that. And let's just like recognize that being an effective hiring manager interviewer is a skill. It's not an inherent trait. And like any other skill, it takes training and repetition to be really great at it. If you're not doing hiring manager interviewer training, what ends up happening in a company is people are bringing in their past experiences and relying on those to think about what an effective hiring manager looks like or effective interviewing looks like. And guess what? They might be bringing in bad habits from other companies, or maybe habits or principles that aren't aligned with how the company wants to think about talent in recruiting and hiring. And so what you end up getting is everyone bringing their own experiences, and you get this Frankenstein type of approach to hiring.
100%.
One team is putting in a bar raiser program. One person is doing a hiring committee. One person is doing hiring manager only making decisions. All of a sudden you have these inconsistencies. And what drives founders and CEOs crazy is inconsistent hiring. And they might call it holding the bar or talent density of quality of hire. But all of that, it just means that they don't have confidence in the hiring process. And they don't have confidence in the hiring process because they haven't really put in the right foundation or haven't established, here's what that means for our company.
Right. And that's where recruiting teams and leaders can absolutely be a trusted advisor in recommending, because it's their expertise area. So that's great. Okay, so we have influence with data, market insight, shared accountability. What is the fourth attribute here?
Yeah, and these are in no particular order, but someone who's really effective at building relationships. If the recruiting and talent leader is a business leader first and a talent leader second, all business leaders work cross-functionally and collaboratively to drive business outcomes. So that means that they're putting the hat they're wearing first in the room on these conversations is how is this talent and how can we help unlock or drive business? How can recruiting help? What part do we play in that? It's not the defensive of, we can't do that, you should do that, this is broken. It's more of, how can we enable your goals and can we help the business be successful? That's the lens through which you're operating. And thinking about that, again, we are on the same side of the table versus across the table.
Yep.
And so one thing that we see often with recruiting leaders who are more service providers is that they're overly defensive or protective of their team. And one of the really important skills to learn as a recruiting leader is the judgment of what information do you let through to your team and what information do you protect or block your team from? When are you defensive of your team and when are you critical of your team, right? And so a true business leader is thinking objectively and critically at all times around the business and including their team. And we see often recruiting leaders, regardless of years experience, plateau at the director level, if you will, because they are defensive of their team. And other teams see that, and then you get put into the, all right, I'm going to fill out this rec. You go fill that rec for me. You're a staffing organization to me. You're not a talent advisor to me.
Right. Yeah, that actually kind of brings up a follow-up question I had of, how does your leader, your recruiting leader, being a trusted advisor, help your IC recruiters, RCs, sourcers, mid-level managers on the team? How have you seen that play out in the past?
Cool. I love this question. Let me give you a tactical and a strategic way.
Great.
The strategic way is it just sets a tone for how they operate as well, right? So people inevitably mirror aspects of their leader. So if you as a trusted advisor are really curious about the business, you understand how the company makes money, you really are asking, sitting side by side with an engineer to understand the tech stack. What is it you do as an engineer? Can I shadow you for a day? Like that curiosity and understanding is not only going to make you a better recruiter, but you're going to be seen as like someone who really cares about engineering in that example. So your team, your sourcers will start, and your recruiters will start to actually mirror that, right? And so they'll be more curious about the business. They'll be more engaged with their hiring managers and teams because they feel like a part of a single team versus two different functions. So strategically, they'll start mirroring your behavior. Pragmatically is, as a trusted advisor, you're going to be in more conversations. You're going to have access to more information ahead of time that's going to prepare your recruiting team. So let's just go back to this sales example of, if you're a service provider, which we were at that time with Pinterest, is that we got handed a number. That means we weren't in conversations in September, October, November to know this is the year of monetization. We're going to need to staff up in H1. If we are more in a trusted advisor spot, I would have had access to information that I could start to share with my team and start resourcing my team ahead of plan, or have more contingency levers I could pull to quickly ramp up our team. So that access to information, one, gives more business insight to like what's happening in the business and the why, but also prepares the team for these shifts in business conditions. And so that helps the team. Like, information is power, and that helps the recruiting team feel more valued when you're giving them insights to the business because you're in more conversation as trusted advisor.
Yeah, and I can definitely say, as someone who has done a lot of recruiting, it's very frustrating to just be handed a goal or to be expected to fulfill what seems like, a super wildly out of this world, number of hires. And you're like, it's really discouraging and demotivating when you get your number and your first thought is, there's literally no way. And I think having your leader be a good trusted advisor to the business, that would minimize some of that frustration. And I presume probably recruiters would want to stay longer. They'd be more motivated to work. They're excited to work with the business. And when you think about recruiters being the face of, candidate experience and candidate attraction, it really helps bring candidates in and makes them feel like, oh, this person really loves working here. So I think all those things can really contribute to better outcomes for the recruiting teams.
Yeah, and maybe just to say that in a different way is we know recruiting is tip of the spear. And if your recruiting team isn't engaged and fired up and believers, it's really hard for them to be effective. And so
Yep.
to your point, it makes the team more not only engaged, but more successful in what they do.
Awesome. One other question I had for you before we jump into a little bit of how, strong stakeholder engagement and talent advisory has really accelerated your career. What conversations have come up the most recently with talent leaders?
Yeah, there's a couple things top of mind right now for talent leaders. One that I think we're hearing a lot from is concept of talent density. And it's not just in the recruiting side of things alone, it's also within, the existing employees that you have. But, it's pretty interesting because talent density is essentially quality of hire in a lower volume hiring environment. In a high volume hiring environment, we know is quality of hire. And so it's really tough to be a CEO because you're always afraid of the quality of people coming into your company. In high volume, you're like, wow, we're hiring a lot. I'm worried that we are lowering the bar to meet a hiring number. When they are low hiring environment, you're like, wow, we have a lot of people interested in coming to work here, a lot of referrals, a lot of inbound. How do I know that we're seeing the entire market, that we're hiring the best one, right? So it's like, damned if you do and damned if you don't. It's a tough way to live, but that's what it is. And like the recruiting leader is often the beneficiary of that anxiety. So right now, a lot of the companies we're talking to who think really critically about talent are thinking about this concept of talent density. And how do we have surety that we're hiring the best person when it's a more favorable market than it was? And a lot of the times it does come back to really structured interviewing and really getting clear on what you're looking for in a candidate. So we see larger companies spending time and resources into these job analysis. Job analysis is like a real deep IO-psych approach to thinking about and studying the actual employees in the company of like what success looks like and what are the characteristics, what are the transferable skills that make someone really good at that specific job, and then pulling that back into the assessment process. That's a larger company concept, a great one, and most companies that think really critically account will eventually get there. But for smaller companies, they're really thinking about back to that early first step of scoping a role as a trusted advisor, really helping a hiring manager think critically of what the work is going to be, what success looks like, how do we conjugate those into actual competencies, experiences, and skills, and how are we creating focus areas for interviewers with question banks and rubrics so we get better inter-rater reliability around what great looks like. By the way, all that information is super helpful for your sourcing strategy and outreach strategy too, but it also helps you make sure you're getting to the outcome that drives the business need from the start.
Totally. What I found too is that when companies don't do that on the intake because they're trying to save time or move fast or any of those, kind of reasons, they end up having to redo a lot of the work, and it's costing them time, it's costing them money, it's costing them someone starting the job and getting ramped up. So for anyone out there listening, don't skimp. Put the time in up front. It's a super, super important part because the more time you have to spend doing it later, you're just creating a bottleneck really for yourself.
We think it's much better to measure 3 times and cut once than to go back and have to cut a whole new piece of wood. And so think about the cost of a few extra minutes to measure versus a new 2x4. It's quite a bit. And so it behooves you to do it up front. Otherwise, you are accumulating a lot of recruiting debt that ultimately cascades into a whole reset and change management process. Often that's a change of recruiting leadership. That's a change of recruiting tool. It's really heavy to do all those things and very costly. So better do it up front. The second thing I think that happens as a result of that is leaders put in these speed bumps or checks and balances or safety nets because they don't trust the process. So bar raiser programs, hiring committees, CEO reviewing every offer or packet. You've seen these like stopgap measures that sometimes just become ubiquitous in the company, or it can be short-term things because that leader is concerned about the process. And so you can do these fixes, or you could change the system. And we find the most scalable long-term solution is actually to make the company effective at hiring, not just specific people or small pods of people or one or two leaders at it, because it actually will be a blocker at some point. And when you think about creating a culture of talent and recruiting, what message is that sending to your interviewers or hiring managers if you're removing influence or decision-making into the hiring for their team and it's done by a third party? That's an interesting message. I think it sends back to the system. Obviously, companies have been wildly successful with these programs, or maybe they've been wildly successful despite these programs. It's hard to say.
Right, right, for sure. Yes, I did work at a company where most of those things were in play, and it's very, I mean, it made the process probably a lot longer than needed to be, and we lost, I think, out on a lot of great talent because we were too slow. And
it's a hard thing to measure. It does make sense to take time to make the right hire, but it's hard to think about the false negatives or false positives that might have happened or what would the opportunity cost might have been of those. It's a hard thing to measure. But I do think if you're a founder or a leader thinking about what culture do I want to create here in terms of talent, it's an early design decision that I think is important to make and commit to.
exactly. And then at any time, a new hiring manager, a new director in a different business unit could step in and say, okay, I know exactly what I'm doing here. There's a clear process. I feel confident and trust this process because it's been working and the other leaders have bought in and believe in it. So that's important too. Amazing. Well, I would love to hear just a little bit more about how strong stakeholder engagement and being a talent advisor has really helped you accelerate your personal career trajectory.
Yeah, and I feel like it was a lesson I wish I'd learned earlier. And I feel like earlier on in my career, I felt more of a pull to agree in the room. So, Adam, we need recruiting to hire 200 people. I'm like, great. And then I'd go back to my desk like, how are we going to do that? And I think what I learned over time was actually thoughtfully thinking about how to push back or bring insights and have a conversation around that actually helped me gain more value with them and value for my team. So maybe said more concretely, the more confidence I had in my craft and what I knew, and the more clearly and crisply and data backed I was able to make that argument or make that framing for them, the more and more information I got, the more and more meetings I was in, the more and more success we had as a team. And so it almost felt like early on in my career, it's like they'll like me or they'll think highly of recruiting if we agree to what they do.
Yes.
And being liked is not a pathway to getting respect. Getting respect can be a pathway to also being liked. And I had this when you think about how people's personalities are driven, or if you think about strengths finders, things like that, a lot of recruiting leaders are in this woo, like the strengths finders one. Protagonist.
That's
is
my
like
number
60%.
one. Woo is my number one.
And so think about like woo is, and why you're kind of maybe drawn to be in recruiting is, love working with people
Totally.
and love meeting new people. But part of it is also like insatiable need to be liked. Right. And what I learned through mistakes, that it wasn't enough to be liked, wasn't a path to success or or gaining influence, but building respect was. And so respect was meaning understanding my craft, being a business leader, being self-critical, but also knowing, having first principles and being a structured thinker and knowing when to kind of anchor in and like hold the line on certain things and why, and not for moral reasons or any other reason, but like principally, that's what you believed and felt was the right thing to do, got me a lot further than, and almost like not caring if people like me actually led to being more respected and probably liked than just being seen as, he's a nice guy, that's a nice team. And that feels a little bit like, let's put baby in a corner.
Mm-hmm. It's such a tough balance because like I said, woo is my number one Clifton strength, but I also felt myself maybe being a little bit like too chippy at trying to overcorrect. I would get really immediately frustrated. I would, kind of try to like fight back a little bit too hard for that respect. And so there's
Yeah.
definitely a really fine balance, and it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, one, gain respect by giving respect and understanding someone else's craft and trade, but the more curious you are about someone else and their role and their side of the business and things like that, I think the better off you're going to be, and the more curious they're going to become about what you're doing and what you can, what you're bringing to the table.
Can we dig in there on two things?
Yeah.
Three things. So one would be, when you have a soaring strength, you often try to counterbalance with like too harsh of a flip. And so
hmm
under duress, Shannon, I imagine you got super chippy, right? So there's this adjusted style that you have
Yeah.
as a leader that is an overcorrection to a strength of yours. And so, we often do this exercise in our leadership training academies is like, at your best day, how are you showing up?
Exactly.
On your worst day, how you're showing up. And I imagine you and I on our worst day would show up as very like curt, chippy, a little grumpy, short with people, right? And that was like an overcorrection to when you fall off the cliff of woo, right? There's like an underbelly
exactly.
of this, like
You're overwooed.
you're overwooed, and so, which is
Yeah.
underwhelming for everyone. And so, understanding your strengths is really important, but also understanding the dark side of it. And then the
Yeah.
second point is like, as you're building teams or surrounding yourself with how are you finding complementary pieces to yourself? And we often, early hiring managers, early recruiting leaders hire people who are shades of themselves. And so you end up building a team that's high woo, and like that's bad for everyone. And so how you like think about your team as a puzzle by start understanding your strengths and what are complementary pieces is really important. The third is like thinking about really understanding yourself. And when you think about being a trusted advisor, is understanding influencing styles. So no different than when you're a manager. One thing that early managers learn the hard way is people need to be managed in a way that they need to be managed, not in the way that you would want to be managed, right?
Yes.
And if you're an early manager, we're probably all laughing at ourselves like, oh my gosh, I was such an idiot early on as a manager. I was, recognizing people in front of their peers because that's how I like to be recognized. But like, oh my gosh, that could
it's
be
like
mortifying.
the love languages.
Yes. So understanding your influencing style is really important, but also understanding how your leaders or stakeholders need to be influenced is really important. So there's three influencing styles. There's rational, social, and emotional. So rational means that you're using logic and using data to persuade. You appeal to authority. They're negotiating or trade-offs is really important to them. So that's rational. Social is like you really get to know them. You kind of build rapport. You want to leverage that rapport in a relationship. You're seeking their consults. Tell me like, oh, I really want to, like, I'd really love to know your opinion on this. Or you seem to be an expert in this area. Can you tell me more? Can you give me some advice on this? That's social. Emotional is appealing to someone's values or modeling ways you'd like others to behave. Like, hey, I know this topic is really important to you personally. I know this is a core value for you. That's why I think this. And so understanding and actually mapping out before you go into a conversation with a leader, what influential style might they be? And then what information you use, how you use it, that helps inform that so you get to the outcome that you want.
Yeah. And for any of our listeners that are on the individual contributor side, the same is true for managing up to your recruiting leader or people operations leader or manager. The more that you can meet someone where they're at and play to how they want to be communicated to, it's just going to be, you're going to be in such a better off situation. So definitely amazing insight there. So I think we're coming up on our time. Where should people go to learn more about you and GBD?
Yeah, a lot about GBD can be found on our website or our company LinkedIn page, but our website is gbdtalent.com. There's information on all of our trainings that we do, our advisory work, some of our search work. We have a blog off of there as well, where we share a lot of these findings and frameworks and things that you can leverage either as a recruiter, emerging leader, or a current recruiting leader. So a lot of great information there. And obviously you can follow us on our company and LinkedIn page. We have a monthly community newsletter that we publish with information around this and really great topics along other industry news. So I would definitely invite you to follow us and become a part of our recruiting community.
Amazing. And how about you? Just in case people want to follow you directly.
Yeah, you can follow me on LinkedIn. Adam Ward, hopefully easy to find. Adam P. Ward is the handle on that. That's generally where I'm sharing most information and insights, and happy to connect with all of you there.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thanks again. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. It was great having you on Offer Accepted, and thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.